I've been remembering lately the summers of my childhood. Billy Collins can make light of forgetfulness. At my age, I often do myself. When I can't remember somebody's name, for example, I try telling myself that it's not that the retrieval mechanism has deteriorated. It's just that the Rolodex is overfull. But I also know from pastoral experience that some forms of memory loss are much more serious and even tragic, both for those suffering them and those caring for them. At 76, I find myself in something of a sweet spot. I'm detached enough from things in the past that I can follow Eliot's advice and make use of memory. In writing a memoir of my now 50 years of ministry, the anniversary of my ordination coming up this November, I can recall the rewards and delights of this calling and let go of, be detached from, or even forget, or just remember with more bemusement than bitterness some of the other trials along the way. The title I'm using for the book is the same as this sermon, Something Left Over, because it's a reference to that quotation I put on the order of service from my mentor, the late John Eartha, an African-American Unitarian Universalist, who said that all of us can be ministers one to another, helpers, leaders, because doing so is nothing more than having something left over after taking care of yourself, to take care of others, to care for others, for their needs, and for the issues that affect us all. I'm remembering the summer that I applied to work with John. I was just out of college, 21. And he was interviewing me to be a counselor at Homestead 2 on the shores of Moose Pond in Maine, where this leadership development camp took place. And when I told him I was planning on going into the Unitarian Universalist ministry, he memorably just stared at me for a moment and then said, "Really? Is that your own idea, or have you just been poorly advised?" Last week, my San Francisco grandchildren, whom I mentioned before, started at the same summer day camp together. Isabel at 15, a junior counselor, and 11-year-old Hannah as a camper. On Monday evening, they came home and told their mother that they both hated the place and the program. "Well," said my daughter, and I must admire her for this, "then for the next 3 weeks, you'll be learning how to get through something that you don't much care for." On Tuesday, Hannah came home and said, "Well, it was okay. I liked the girls who asked me to sit with them at lunch." And Isabel said, "Today I figured out why they're paying me and what I can learn about working with 6- and 7-year-olds. Yeah, marking a birthday and an anniversary this week, it felt like this was the right thing to talk with you about. That dual event fell right between my wife's graduation from Yale Divinity School and her being ordained as a deacon in the Episcopal Church at Grace Cathedral. We got married on a Wednesday night. It was cheap, and we had no money. This week, we celebrated by splurging on a matinee performance of that great Stephen Sondheim musical about parents and children, Into the Woods. Oh. Then we went and had a drink up at the top of the Mark, the hotel where we had our brief honeymoon. And when we told them that we'd done that, they brought us champagne before we went out to a romantic dinner at a favorite restaurant. And just last night, we were with Hannah and Isabel and their parents, remembering why we retired out here. Because although the physicists still haven't explained how it works, grandchildren, in my experience, exert gravitational pull on their grandparents. Here's my current mantra with them. Work to make every day meaningful. Notice delight. Much of what I've written about my experience of ministry is in gratitude for those who showed me what it's all about, even when I had to learn the hard way. I was so lucky in my early mentors. The Reverend Barbara Holleroth, may she rest in peace, was one of the few women in parish ministry in the early 1970s, when she became my first model for ministry. And on one memorable occasion, I said, "Barbara, I'm not sure how to do that." And she just looked at me and said, "In ministry, John, the point is not to learn exactly what to do. The point is to learn to behave well when you don't know what to do." Memorable words. And then there was the Reverend Dean Starr, my second mentor, the father of 6 children, when he shocked us all by coming out of the closet as a gay man. He taught me, if nothing else, to listen not only to what people say and do, but also attend to what they don't say or fully reveal. The theme of worship at UUP this month has been delight. And some of you may have been here 2 weeks ago when my sermon was called, "Oh, taste and see how the holy or the whole is good," and how we followed it up with that unorthodox communion of chocolates and strawberries. So it would be easy to just recall for you how some of my moments in ministry have indeed been delightful. Like the joy of dedicating a newborn child and lifting it up like the Lion King in front of the congregation. Or having that child come back years later and say, "Here's the photo of you lifting me up." And asking the congregation to bless me. And guess what? It took. Or some of the memorable couples whose weddings I've been privileged to celebrate. Interfaith couples, interracial couples, same-sex couples. One memorable wedding where both parties were in wheelchairs. People who've stayed friends with me on Facebook through 50 years, giving me the privilege of following their lives and noting their deaths. Or the privileged role I enjoyed for 8 years as president of our denomination, meeting with literally popes and presidents, carrying messages on behalf of the World Conference on Religion and Peace. Or the memorable time that all the small UU congregations in the great state of Alaska gathered in Anchorage to meet with me and hear me preach, and my host, who'd grown up in the church that I had served in Dallas, introduced me by taking out of his pocket a printed copy of a sermon that he had heard me preach. One Sunday when he was back home having dropped out of college, depressed because his girlfriend had dumped him. And that sermon, which I recall as being not very good, called The Responsible Life, was grounded in the simple observation that being responsible begins with learning to respond and notice what others sometimes turn away from, and responding as well as you can. And that, said Matt Clayman, is why I came here to Alaska in my gap year to work on fishing boats. I then decided to go back and become a labor and environmental attorney because of this sermon. He went on to become president of the city council in Anchorage, and then acting mayor, 7 years as an assemblyman, and when I saw him again last summer, he was successfully running for the state Senate, where he now chairs the Judiciary Committee, working across party lines to keep MAGA ideologues and fact deniers from sitting on the bench. Friends, this kind of experience in ministry is why I refuse to give up on democracy, whether it is in our congregations or in our country. In its purest form, of course, it's always an elusive ideal. Even in its actualized, imperfect American form, however, I believe it remains what Lincoln called the last great hope of earth. This week I read a book saying that the challenge is to overcome the dominance in our culture of savior theologies, of empire and exception and extraction, with an alliance of secular and religious forces that are emancipatory, equitable, with an ethos based on empathy, not on sick notions that greed is good, or that white supremacy and heterosexism are God-ordained, or that the US, in all of its imperfection, is always on the side of the angels. Because history, collective memory, when it is not suppressed, but remembered accurately, shows that none of those statements can stand the test of truth and time. But because we've been so privileged in this country as Americans as to become both the largest economy and the largest, longest lasting imperfect democracy on the planet, we have, I believe, a unique responsibility that begins in the human spirit to confront the climate crisis and the conflicts upon the planet that now threaten the human future. So when I think back on my own childhood and the things that impelled me into public ministry, what I recall most vividly are those delightful summers of playing freely in the natural world. Far more freely, frankly, than my children can do today in their urban environment. In seeing the lake near our house in the Midwest become too dirty to swim in, and a river nearby actually catch on fire from pollutants. And then, amazingly, because we paid attention and became more responsible, those things coming back to life. The lake resurrected, not without losses, but back to life. I won't kid you. Not all of my experiences as a minister have been those of delight. I hope I'll celebrate that 50th anniversary with you here next November. In fact, I can't help but recall that some of the worst moments in my formation as a minister remain enduringly important and meaningful and memorable. 3 years after I was ordained, when I was still 28, I had to minister in one horrible winter week to the suicides of 3 near age mates. One young, gifted, and black, who had grown up in the congregation I was then serving in Knoxville, Tennessee. He'd become a concert pianist and a gifted actor. But as I later discerned, he was probably also gay and couldn't fully face that fact or trust acceptance even in his own family. The second was a young woman I now consider as a victim of our deinstitutionalization of psychiatric hospitals, and I was something of a chaplain to the psychologists in the area. And the third was a law student who endured an LSD flashback and lit himself on fire like a Buddhist monk in his own mother's backyard. Among the experienced, it's often said that nobody ever becomes a minister until they've been through the ritual, just because of the ritual called ordination. That only happens when you have your really tough first funeral. And that, of course, happened to me that week, when I didn't think I had anything left over. My dear wife, ordained in her own tradition, went to be with the mother of that last young man, a woman we both loved, and just be with her in her shock and grief while I did the funeral for the young, gifted black man. The head usher at the UU church that day was a man named Wade Till, God love him, a white Mississippi cousin of young Emmett Till. And he just took one look at me, his young, almost paralyzed parson, and put his arm on my shoulder and said, memorably, "Well, I know one young preacher is going to earn his pay this week for a change." And knocked me right out of any impulse towards self-pity, to be present to the people who needed me. Which Wade, like all my other mentors, had showed me was something that we all can share. Something that is left over after our self-concern, to care about others and for the justice causes that affect us all. So now, as I think back on what it was in my own childhood that gave me the faith that I could find something like that in myself to serve others, it's a mixed bag. Partly, I think it was my parents referring to their 3 sons, myself and 2 younger brothers, 5 and 7 years my junior, as John and the boys. The parentified child frequently feels the call to serve others. Or the captivity of my father by corporate America, often gone on business trips, with me in charge of those brothers. I also think about my mother's parents, whom I think I've told you before, came as orphans from Slovakia, met and married one another in Chicago before World War I. And then by the end of the last great pandemic, the influenza plague of 1918 to 20, lost all 4 of those children, and yet found within themselves the faith to go on and have my mother, born in 1921, and then 2 more children. I'll be honest, it's taken me these 50 years to learn to do what I try to do here among all of you. Just delight in your manifold diversity, your vulnerable humanity, your varied gifts, the challenges you all face, as we all do, the talents you so freely give to one another to build beloved community here. And then how you weave together with others in the wider world what I think our democracy and our fragile planet most desperately need. The solidarity of those who can delight in life itself and find something left over after caring for self, to care for this mother of us all, this earth, and for the generations yet to come, who may yet emerge upon her lap. This is our simple and yet profound mission in this place, here at UUP. May you find your own best self here, your own place, and your unique mission here among us. Blessed be Shanti, Om, Salam, and Amen.